Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Professor Ben Heineman, for coming, although he's told me that I can call him Ben.
Please.
And for the Japanese audience, of course, everybody knows Professor Heineman very well, but he's written a book called The Inside Counsel Revolution, which has recently been translated into Japanese as the 企業法務改革. And I'm sitting here with Ben today to talk about his book and the concepts set forth in the book.
And it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to address, even from a distance and on film, the association, which is a very distinguished group of lawyers. So it's a great honor for me.
And just for the Japanese audience, everybody knows, of course, Ben very well, but let me briefly touch upon his illustrious career. Ben is a graduate of Harvard College and Oxford University, and he obtained his JD, Juris Doctor, from Yale Law School. He was law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart and Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. He was GE's Senior Vice President, General Counsel from 1987 to 2003, and then Senior Vice President for Law and Public Affairs from 2004 until his retirement. He's currently Senior Fellow at Harvard Law School's program on the legal profession and its program on corporate governance, a Senior Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and lecturer at Yale Law School. So thank you once again for being with me and being with us, the audience here in Tokyo. So Ben, you wrote this book called The Inside Counsel Revolution. And first of all, let me ask you, why did you name your book The Inside Counsel Revolution?
Because I think there had been two very significant changes in the role of inside lawyers, the lawyers that I'm speaking to in Japan today. This started in the United States, and we can discuss this later, but I believe it's a movement that is going global. And the two parts of the revolution are first inside, where the general counsel is no longer just a technical answering low-level questions, but is a member of management, involved obviously in law, but in risk, in ethics, in compliance, in governance, in citizenship, in performance, in all the activities of the corporation, and indeed sits at the table with the top management. The general counsel is involved not only in policy decisions and about what to do, but is deeply involved in execution, is very close, hopefully, to the CEO. And because of the status now of being a full member of the business team, is viewed, at least in the United States and the major companies, as the equivalent in stature and importance, in compensation, in talent, to the chief financial officer. This was not true 30 years ago. There was clearly a big difference between the CFO, very much top management, and the general counsel, who was important to the corporation but not part of top management. So first part of the revolution is becoming a core member of the top management team and the equivalent of the CFO. And the second revolution is in relation to the outside providers, the outside law firms, where 30 or 40 years ago, the lawyers inside of the corporation were people who had not made partner in law firms. They were really second-class citizens. They could not do the work. They just called the firms up and sort of threw the work over the transom to the law firms. I'm overstating, but that really was a general view. And since then, however, because of the increased talent of the general counsel and all the inside lawyers, the power has shifted over both money and matters. With respect to matters, the inside lawyers now set the strategy. At the company I worked for, I had experts in every major area of the law: labor, employment, environment, antitrust, tax, trade. And these people had either come from major law firms or from the government. They were as talented and as sophisticated as the lawyers in the law firms. So we basically, inside the company, the inside lawyers had control over the matters. Of course, we partnered with the outside firms, but we had control over the strategy and over the major decisions. In a second way, there also was a change, which is that we no longer just took one-line bills that said for services rendered, but began to be very critical and skeptical and concerned about the amount of money that we were paying to firms. So we tried to exert discipline on the billing process, on what we were charged. That's a long story. We can get into that if you wish. But so in those two respects, both a major change inside and a major change outside, there was a revolution. Let me say a last thing about the outside. One of the other aspects of the outside change, in addition to the change of power relationship between the law department and the law firm, where the law department has far more power today than it did 30 or 40 years ago, is the general counsels are now also becoming public spokesmen, public figures for the corporation, not just with respect to problems where they have to maybe stand up and explain what the problem was and what is being done, but also on affirmative matters such as public policy or business in China. The general counsels are now much more than in the past spokespersons, if you will, for the company. My favorite example, and a good friend of mine, is a man named Brad Smith, who was the general counsel at Microsoft, is now in fact the president of Microsoft and the chief legal officer. He is an expert on technology and information technology on one hand, and then national security, civil rights and civil liberties, privacy, and is a national spokesman on the intersection between those big, broad, and conflicted subjects. So that's the revolution in a nutshell.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. So you talk about this revolution from within, the rise of the role of GCs. You also talk about the rise in the outside world. But for the Japanese audience, it's actually very rare, as you might know, for Japanese companies to have GCs. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about how in the last 30 years this rise of the GCs actually came about in the U.S. Because you talked about, the rise itself, but what was the impetus behind the rise of the GCs within the company? And was that fueled by the outside revolution that you talked about, or is it the other way around?
I think there are many factors about why there was an inside revolution in the United States, which is now, I think, for sure spread to Europe, and it's spread, I believe, to multinational companies in Asia as well. And you may be an example of a person who was part of the revolution, as you were a general counsel in Tokyo for a major international company. Historically, it actually goes back to the 19th century in America, when there, as people may be well aware, the railroads, the steel companies, there was a huge growth of industry. And there was a tremendous amount of work being done on the legal relationships between those companies. And so the lawyer actually became a very significant figure even then in the 19th and early 20th century, phenomena that was written about by Louis Brandeis, who was a very famous legal thinker and jurist in the United States, who said that lawyers, even then, had a role of statesman, because, meaning that they had to look not just at the law, but at the broader interests of the corporation, because the corporations were so powerful. And of course, with the sugar trusts or the rail trusts or the banking trusts, they were extremely powerful until they were broken up by the antitrust laws and by reforms of the progressive era. So that background had always existed. And then in the time that I became general counsel at GE, which was in the 80s, there were already murmurings for a lot of different reasons. Globalization, concern about money, the need to move, the business becoming more complex and needing fast action inside the company where you didn't have time necessarily to go hire an outside lawyer, even if they were well known to you, and bring them in. Many people in the audience will know that if you're inside the company, you have a much better knowledge of what the company does.
Right.
So there are a whole number of factors. I think there are also scandals, and the companies needed to prevent them, number one, and needed to have someone of stature who had a reputation outside the company to be able to stand up and represent them. I, for example, was fortunate. I mean, I don't mean to be immodest, but I was a editor-in-chief of the Law Journal. I was a Supreme Court law clerk. I was a sub-cabinet officer in the government. I was a Supreme Court advocate for a major firm. So I wasn't someone who had grown up in GE. I came in sideways. At 42, I just came from outside to become general counsel of the company. The point of the story is that I had some stature outside of GE, which was important to GE in terms of a variety of both offensive and defensive issues. So there are a lot of reasons why this happened. And once GE actually got a lot of attention, because not only did Jack Welch, who was a famous CEO and I think actually well known in Japan,
yes,
as his predecessor Thomas Edison, although it was 100 years before. He not only hired me, but he allowed me to hire about 30 people from outside. We transformed the whole legal department in GE, so I hired great partners, great people from government. I hired the very best people, and he was willing to pay market price. So suddenly, overnight, from 1987 to about 1991 or 2, we went from being, I would say, your average, somewhat mediocre inside law department to being a great international law firm that happened to be situated inside of a corporation. I mean, that sent shockwaves through the legal profession in the United States and to some extent in Europe, and other boards and CEOs, partly because of the model that GE always was for other companies. Other boards and CEOs began to get the picture and began to realize that actually it was more productive and more cost efficient to make rather than buy in legal services if you had great talent that could handle the most difficult problems. The best and first hire I made, and this is no offense to all my other colleagues, was a tax lawyer named John Samuels, who came from the Treasury Department and from a private law firm and taught tax law. He was a great practitioner and theorist. He was could play all positions and was terrific. And so he then set the model that attracted the attention of the CEO and allowed me to then hire other people like him to create this terrific inside law firm. And that then, as I said before, got the attention of other boards and CEOs and led to the complete upgrading and change in the nature of the inside lawyers.
Thank you, Ben. So in the context of Louis Brandeis, you mentioned this term statesman. And in fact, in your book, too, you talk about the lawyer statesman. You state that the head of legal should be a lawyer statement. And by this, you'll state that he or she must be an outstanding technical expert, wise counselor, and an accountable leader. Could you elaborate for us
Surely.
What you mean by statement? Because statement is something that may not necessarily be a familiar tune to the Japanese audience.
I'm not sure that my friends who are watching this will get the nuance, but I think I'm safer if I call it statesperson rather than statesman, because man is gender specific, and the statesperson applies to people of both genders, races, whatever, nationalities, ethnic groups, etc. I think the key point about the statesperson is that their first question that they ask, which we all understand, is an action by the corporation legal? So the first question is it legal? But the last question, which the general counsel as statesperson should ask, but so should the CEO, and so should the CFO, and so should the division leaders, and so should the vice chairs and whomever, is it right? And right is a very broad concept. It involves the safety and quality of the products. It involves the impact on society. It involves a broad range of considerations that go far beyond the technical question of is it legal. I also believe, Claire, as you said, that we have three fundamental roles, at least as inside business lawyers. Number one, we're clearly technical experts. Is it legal? And we may discuss in a moment, that's not an easy question to answer sometimes. But we also are really wise counselors, because I indicated at the beginning, part of the revolution is sitting at the table with management so that their discussions are very far-ranging. It's not that we are going to say, here's what you should do, but we can ask a lot of good questions. We can be skeptical. We can basically try to enrich and broaden the consideration of the matters And we may, depending on how much knowledge we may have a view where we feel confident about giving a recommendation as a counselor. And lastly, we are leaders. I was not only the head of the legal function at GE, I was head of trade, taxes, environmental health and safety, security and crisis management, a lot of different functions. So I had to lead a big hunk of the GE organization. And because the company was so big, when I worked there, we had 320,000 employees in 140 countries. We had $220 billion of revenue and $22 billion in profits. Sadly, much different today. But in those days, we were literally the biggest company in the world as measured by market cap. And it was not possible, remotely possible, for the CEO to make decisions, all decisions. So I would say that in all my different functions, all those different units that I was responsible for, probably 80 to 85% of my time, I was the last decision maker in this huge multinational company. The buck truly stopped with me because Jack Welch, or the CEO and the board, couldn't possibly review all the things that were under my purview, partly because that purview was very broad and partly because the company was so much more complex even than what I was doing. So the leadership part as a final decision maker was a truly important part. So I think all lawyers, in my judgment, and I teach now at Harvard and Yale, and I teach 25-year-olds, but I tell them that at law school, you're being taught to be an expert. You're taught how to manipulate and understand the vocabulary of the technical law and how to deal it. But what we don't do enough for all lawyers is teach them how to be counselors, wise counselors, and then accountable leaders. So I believe that those three simple words hide a great deal of complexity, but they state the essence of what we ought to aspire to be, especially those of you in the audience who work for companies.
Mm-hmm. So in the audience, I'm sure we have legal department heads. We also have members of the legal department who may not necessarily be the head of legal. And you talk about, a good in-house lawyer must know what is right in the sense of what ought to be the case. Now, as a person, let's say a young person in the legal department, how is he or she to know what is right?
Well, let me approach it in two ways, and you stop me if I talk too long. One of the aspects of being a lawyer statesperson is to have what I call complementary competencies, which are not just the core competencies are the legal training that we get and that you got and that I got about, again, how to understand the law, predict what the law is going to be, how to do contracts, litigate cases, worry about intellectual property, whatever the case may be. But there are complementary competencies which I think lawyers need and which they need to get trained on either by the corporation or by the corporation sending them to some kind of executive education or continuing education. And those are things like understanding public policy, understanding how organizations actually work, understanding how to implement ideas, understanding risk that's way beyond legal risk, understanding how to generate options about what ought to be. If we want to change the company, we want to change society, we want to change the division in Indonesia, you have to generate options about different ways to do it. Again, that's not something that lawyers are trained to do. And then how do you do an analysis that fairly states the pros and cons, the benefits and debits of these options? So these are all complementary competencies. How do you communicate it in this day and age where it's not just writing a technical legal memo or a brief or a contract, but you have to communicate to a much broader set of constituents? How do you do that in either social media or in articles or in other ways so that you can be clear and precise, but also brief and understood? And I think the last complementary competency, which I think is one of the most important, maybe the most important, is learning how to define problems properly. Many of the mistakes that we make, I mean, we just broadly in business, but even more broadly than that, is that we don't define the problems properly because we don't consider all the relevant factors that are going to determine what our decision what effect it's going to have. And so I think one of the things that people need to be trained on, and there are business schools or law schools or public policy schools who teach this, is take a set of facts, but how do you define the problem around those facts? If I gave you a hypothetical, how would you define sort of the issues that are raised and their interrelationship? That sounds very abstract, but defining the problem as a complementary competency is a really important thing. So on one hand, we have to have these statespeople who are worrying about the what is right question have these kinds of complementary competencies. Do you want me to keep going?
Sure, why not?
Okay. But the other part of the problem is how do we identify and think about what is right? And part of that is a process for generating issues where we look at other companies, we look at competitors, we look at customers, we look at NGOs, we look at legislatures, we look at the media, we look at academia to see what kinds of issues that are relevant to us are being raised. And then we have to determine whether we're going to bother analyzing those issues and considering whether or not to take action. We may not. So it's a double triage situation where you sort of have a whole panoply of issues, a whole menu of issues. You decide which ones are the most important to analyze, and then you have to decide whether or not you're going to take action. Often the action may be voluntary, which I would call ethical. The difference between law and ethics is that law is mandated. It's what you have to do because society has mandated, either through legislation or regulation or court decisions, versus ethics, where the company can make a voluntary decision to adopt a norm which has the effect of law. Once you've said you shall not discriminate, or you shall build plants to world standards, and that becomes a norm of the company, then if you fail to do that, you can be sanctioned just as much as if you violated the law, or you can be rewarded if you do an extremely good job. So one aspect of this is identifying those kinds of issues about what is right, the issues that you would want to consider as because they're the right thing to do. And then the second dimension of it is to make the decision about it. How do you make the decision? And again, without giving you my law school lecture, I think it has two dimensions. One is what I would call prudential, which is how do the various constituencies and people interested in the corporation respond to it? How do the shareholders view an action? How do the customers? How do the employees? How do the creditors? How do the partners? Whomever. So that is a practical question about the impact of the action in the world, both how it is the impact and how the impact will be perceived, because sometimes the perception may be different than the actual impact. And yet another complexity is that there is no such thing as a shareholder or an employee or a creditor. It's a zoo. It is a menagerie. They come in on different shapes and sizes, different parts of the world, different interests, and so it's quite a complicated process to decide which of the shareholders or which of the employees or which of the customers are the most important, and try to understand the impact. So, as I say, in making these decisions, as opposed to identifying them, in making these decisions, you first have to look at the prudential dimensions. And then the second part of it is what I would call the moral dimensions. I do believe that companies, especially their CEOs and their boards and their top management, have a view of morality. And it's not that they want to impose their own morality on the company, but they view these as norms of society or duties that are owed to one of the constituencies. And there are such things as loyalty, fiduciary duty, transparency, candor, reliability, those kinds of really practical ethical norms that then can get translated into actual operational norms that become rules of the corporation. So as deciding what's right, you have to have these complementary competencies, you have to basically have a process for identifying the issues, and then you have to apply both prudential and moral considerations in making the decisions. And it's not easy. And in the company I was in, we had a meeting every twice a year of the top management, from the CEO, all the top operating leaders. It was staffed by the general counsel and the CFO to present the issues, to decide which ones we would analyze in depth, and then once we analyzed them in depth, which ones we would take action on, adopt some kind of norm for the company. So that's an overview, but it's in response to your broad question of sort of what does it mean to be right. And again, this is not an argument for a particular ideology. I'm not arguing for being progressive or conservative. I also strongly do not believe it's based on a philosophical system. That you don't derive any of this from sort of reading some philosopher. The watchwords I would use are most of these decisions are contextual and multifactorial because they're practical. They have a moral dimension, they've got a prudential dimension. You're trying to do what's right, but they're also arise in a concrete context, and they're usually analyzed best, as I said before, in terms of how do you define the problem correctly. They're analyzed best by looking at multiple factors.
Thank you. So in thinking about what is right, what should be the case, we talked about how the individuals in the legal department may hone their skills in thinking at a problem, identifying issues, and then coming up with decisions. But then as an institution or as an organization of the legal department, how can they form a uniform view on what should be the case?
I don't think there has to be a uniform view. I think there has to be a debate. I think they can, as I indicated before, I think good companies with enough resources, and not every company can do it, can provide continuing education so they can send their best young people off to continuing education at one of the universities where they talk about these things. We had serious internal training. GE, when I was there, was big enough to actually have a university. We had a campus and a school, and about 10,000 people went through there every year in courses that were either 2 weeks or 4 weeks and sometimes 6 weeks. So you can do a certain amount of it yourself. In this day and age, you can have online training. You can basically, let's say an ethical issue arises inside of a division in the company. You can gather the legal and finance teams together. You can get the CEO of the division and have a debate about it. So there's no one way to do it. And I think the important thing is that there be full debate before there's a decision. Once there's a decision, and usually at the top either of a division, if it's a smallish issue, or at the top of the company all the way up to the board, once there has been a decision that an ethical norm is going to be followed. For example, GE decided in the early 90s, a long time ago, we were way ahead of the time, that we would have labor standards at third-party suppliers when we'd offshored work from the United States. And the labor standards were quite complex. It was a fairly major undertaking. But that was a decision that I presented to the CEO. He understood that as an icon of globalization, GE had to take some care not only of its offshore workers, the workers in Vietnam or China or what have you, but also the workers at third-party suppliers to whom we had outsourced business. But that was a decision ultimately that went to the board of directors. They didn't approve every detail of the program, but they approved the program in the broad, and then it was implemented.
Thank you. So another key concept that you mentioned in your book is this partner-guardian tension, the relationship between the CEO and management and the GC. And you state that the head of legal must be a partner to the board of directors, the CEO, and business leaders. You also state later in the book that the role of the GC is expanding. What are the key functions of the GCs vis-a-vis her relationship with the CEO or management? And you mentioned earlier that you met with the management quite frequently. I mean, you were part of management. Right. But can you talk about this?
Let me try to address the tension, because I think this issue is maybe the most important issue that we all face as lawyers inside of corporations. I think we would all agree that we want to be partners with the business leaders, especially the CEO and the board. We want to help them accomplish their goals. And as I indicated before, in terms of the revolution for inside lawyers, we're not just lawyers, we're counselors. We execute, we don't just decide. We deal with risk, we deal with the external world, not just the internal world. As we have abroad, we deal with many different functions. So we have lots of breadth in what we do to be good partners to the CEO. And we're present at most of the major discussions about how to run the company, whether it's how to allocate capital, whether to make a deal, whether to do a new product, whether to go into a new geography, whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, in my judgment, our fundamental role is to be the guardian of the company. Mm-hmm. That we have to protect the integrity of the company. Now, that's ultimately the job of the CEO and the board. But our job, we are especially, hopefully, trained to do that. And integrity is law, ethics, and values. And we need to be the compass, if you will, that helps the CEO and the board guide the ship. And there is a tension between being partner and guardian. One of the problems for inside lawyers is that they often want to be naysayers. They want to always warn, we can't do this, we can't do that. And that goes back to the point I was making before, that we have to be much more sophisticated about not just legal risk, but all risk. Mm-hmm. But if you are a naysayer, you often then get excluded from all the important meetings. They don't want to hear it.
Right.
On the other hand, if you are what I call a yaysayer, if you always say yes, you can end up being indicted. You can't just willy-nilly and reflexively say yes. And there are many scandals, whether it's Siemens or Enron or Wells Fargo or some of the Japanese scandals where there's been failures of quality or financial failures. You can't just say yes to the CEO. You must stand up and say what you think should guide the company and what you think is right. So there is this deep tension between being a partner, which you need to be, and being a guardian, which you absolutely must be. Now, my view is that if you're fortunate in the CEO, you can be a good partner and get a lot of credibility. You can help accomplish all the business goals and the financial performance and all those nice things. And that then gives you credibility to be the guardian when the time comes for you to say, this is too far, we can't do that. This is the line, we can't go over it. And that allows you to be both partner and guardian. But sometimes there's a tension where the CEO only wants to hear about how to get the business goals accomplished and doesn't want to hear about how important integrity is. So the relationship with the CEO is critical, and the CEO's understanding of the lawyer-statesperson ideal, the partner-guardian tension. And one thing that I haven't said, and it's in the very beginning of the book, is that we also need to talk about the purpose of the corporation. I mean, really, it all has reference back to that. And in my judgment, if I had to say it in one sentence, it's high performance with high integrity and sound risk management. That, if I had to say it in one sentence, that is the purpose of the corporation. So notice, high performance, that's the sort of the partner part, but high integrity and sound risk management is the guardian part. And they have to go together. So I don't know if that answers your question, but this is, in my judgment, and having traveled around the world for 30 years, this is the most profound problem that lawyers have to reconcile. How can they both be partners, be in the room, be helpful, get credibility, but when the time comes, how can they be guardians of the company, which is their most important job?
And you also continue to say in your book that in order to solve this tension, the GC actually has to have independence, courage, and tact. Now, what do you mean by tact?
Yeah.
And can you also tell us a little bit about your personal experience and how you were tactful?
Well, that would be self-serving. Obviously, you need the independence and the courage to be able to stand up, and you have to basically I think, in a way, this is something that may be very foreign to my listeners in Tokyo. Is it in Tokyo?
Yes, it is in Tokyo.
In Tokyo, which is that you have to be prepared to resign. You never threaten it. You never even say it. But you have to have the independence and outside reputation, ideally, that the CEO knows that he or she can't push you over a line because you'll just leave. Even though you will leave money on the table. You'll leave stock options or restricted stock or long-term incentive plans or various other emoluments. So you must have that courage and that independence to be able to leave if you need to. In terms of the tact issue, I think there is a cliche in this country, and it may also be a cliche in Japan, which is that you need to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. That one of the great challenges, because CEOs are often impatient, they may be imperious, they may be hot-tempered, they may be just difficult personalities. That's partly why they maybe became CEO, because they're hard-driving and relentless. But you have to find that balance, and I can't explain it any more than just say the words. I mean, each situation will be unique. You have to find the way in which, even under the duress of an angry CEO under Full Sail, you can make your point without sort of inducing even greater anger. Now, this is very difficult. And sometimes you have to wait and go see him separately or her separately. Although I had a CEO who was very smart, super smart, and he would always say at meetings, if you're going to say something, say it now. I don't want to see you in my office later because you're hiding what you really want to say. I mean, he would be very blunt about it. And a lot of CEOs know that. And a lot of CEOs are actors, and they're pushing the meeting in a direction to see if anybody will sort of put up some walls or put some friction in the process. So I think the cliche would be how to disagree without being disagreeable, but also how to disagree and be heard, not be so passive and so meek that you just say the little comment and no one hears you. You have to speak up.
Right. So, is there any training one can receive to be more tactful? How does one become tactful? I mean, do you watch others, or how did you, or is it something?
I would imagine. I mean, I think I was. Whether I was good at it or bad at it, I never had any training. I was fortunate that I worked before I got to GE. I worked in a lot of big public and private institutions. So I observed and was part of. I was in the biggest government agency in the United States. It was bigger than the Defense Department. I worked for a very hard-driving cabinet secretary. I too ran a big staff. So I was the head of a law firm. So I had been fortunate enough, even at a very young age, because I went to GE at 42 as general counsel.
Right.
I'd been fortunate at a very young age to have been thrown in the deep end and had to kind of figure it out. And I think we all know that the greatest teacher of all is experience. I mean, you can go to class, you can have wise people tell you things, but until you've tried it yourself and either succeeded or failed, you haven't really learned.
Okay, well, shall we then dive into some of the concrete issues that you actually talk about in your book? One is with respect to the applicable law. So which law applies, and also how to interpret the law once you've identified which law applies. And in your book, you actually state that oftentimes the legal department does not determine what law is applicable in a particular situation.
No, I don't think I say that. I think what I say is that it's very difficult to know, for example, if you're doing a merger, a cross-border merger, it's difficult to know whether the European Community antitrust law, the U.S. antitrust law, the Japanese antitrust law, the Chinese antitrust law are compatible.
Okay.
Because they're each different. They're each interpreted by a different set of enforcers. Those enforcers have their own policy and political agenda.
Yes.
So I think all I was trying to say is we sort of say law, and you think, well, there's a rule. But all of us who are in the global world, there may be some laws that are very straightforward and not too ambiguous.
Right.
But I dare say the majority of them, have a high degree
Right.
of ambiguity and need interpretation, which is why we have the court system. And we also know that the legislatures who write the law, or even the regulators who announce the regulations, often do it in a vague way because they can't reconcile the differences. They just write some vague language which looks both directions, leaving it to the courts
Right.
to try to determine. So the point of what I was trying to say was if our first job, and I go back to our first job, is to be technical experts and is to say what the law is, that is very complicated. It's complicated because different societies have different legal systems. I mean, forget, just different. They have different laws.
Right.
The law is always in flux. The law is always being interpreted. Law is always changing. I mean, just in the United States, we've gone from basically being a free trade country, and under this administration, all of a sudden, whereas we were in the process not only of getting rid of all tariffs, but we were beginning the work in TPP and in the big trade talks in Europe to get rid of non-tariff barriers, and all of a sudden we've done a flip, and we're sort of back in the tariff world. So the only point is that the world is generally in flux. I'm a believer in constant change, but that means that our job as lawyers, in terms of understanding what law it is, and the reason we're talking about this, is that your basic first order job is to tell the corporation what law it is that you must follow. And when the law is quite ambiguous and subject to interpretation, enormous variation, and flux, that's not so easy. And so you may have to decide that you're going to basically sort of take the strictest law, if you're very cautious, and say, even though that's not the law in Europe, or it may not be the law in Latin America, here's the law we're going to follow just to be safe. Now you can do that, or you can try a different way. There's lots of variations, but the point really is just the inherent uncertainty of the law.
Okay. Now, the audience today is the Keiei-Houyu-Kai, as I mentioned, and they're in Japan. The membership number is currently over 1,200 companies, and the majority is listed in Japan. The majority of the members are also in the manufacturing industry, which is about 55% of the membership, followed by the service industry, 25%, and finance, 15%. This means that the areas of interest for the audience that affect their legal departments are, large, listed, global, which include, I'm sure, conflict between global standard and national law. And I think you may have alluded a little bit earlier when you were talking about the supply chain, third-party suppliers. So you touch upon the conflict between global standards and national law in your book. For example, while there is an increasing movement against child labor, let's say, there may be a country that makes it legal to employ those who may be considered children in other countries. What are the things in-house lawyers should do in thinking through this conflict? This goes back to the very first question of not necessarily just knowing what is legal, but what ought to be the case, what is right.
Well, let's just talk about child labor for a minute, and then I'll give you another example, because this is increasingly a problem for global companies, which is, as I indicated before, they make determinations about ethics, which once they've determined what the norm is, then binds the whole company. It's usually uniform across the globe about what they're going to do. And sometimes those rules may bump into national law. Now, in the case of child labor, a company may decide that rather than just following the law of each jurisdiction, because they're in 140 countries, and to learn the law of each jurisdiction, and each of those laws may have exceptions. You can work when you're 15, but you can't work if you're in a dangerous industry. But what's a dangerous industry? That it may be simpler to just adopt a global standard and say, no child under 16 shall work in our factories or in our third-party suppliers. And that then is a simple rule. But it may be that in some countries the age when kids can work is 14. If you're above 14, you can work, but you would still not be able to work under our standard, which is you can't work if you're under 16. And so you have this potential conflict or tension between what's going on in the locality and what your standard is. So that if you're, for example, in China and they allow people to work when they're 15, but your standard's 16, then you couldn't basically have a third-party supplier who had people who were 15. So there are those kinds of conflicts, and you have to make a determination. Again, each one of these is going to be individualistic, whether you then make an exception, because that's the law of China. On the other hand, the child labor is a hot-button issue in globalization. Mm-hmm. And so you might be fine in China, because that's the rule in China. But in Europe, or maybe in Japan, or in the United States, you could have a news story saying that you're employing child labor, and who cares what the law in China is? You just, as a global company, you shouldn't be doing it. So there's that kind of tension where you've got to make those kinds of decisions between what the national law is and what your standards would be. Another example would be Google, who went to China in 2007. It knew that it was going to be censored, even though it was against censorship. It was, in fact, with its browser, it was, in fact, censored. And in 2010, they basically pulled out because they originally thought that they would basically defer to the national law and not to their own standards against censorship. But 3 years later, they decided it was just too painful. There was just too much problem. So they then exalted their ethical standard of no censorship over the national law, but the implication of that was that they had to leave the society. If you don't like the national law because of your company's values, you can stay and just eat it. I mean, just abide by it. You can stay and try and change the law. You can be civilly disobedient, which is not something that companies do. Individuals can do it, but companies don't usually be civilly disobedient, or you can leave. I mean, another example was South Africa, that companies basically did not like the apartheid system. They kind of were civilly disobedient because they had something called the Sullivan Principles, where they allowed non-discrimination in their workplace, which was really against the apartheid system. But eventually, companies decided to pull out of South Africa. To this fourth option, when you don't like the local law, they said, well, we've tried to change the law, we can't change the law. And it's for a variety of reasons, apartheid was viewed as a practice that international companies could not put up with. And so in the late 80s and early 90s, a number of companies pulled out of South Africa before there were then sanctions. There were then global sanctions after that, but they made an individual decision to leave. So my only point here, and it's something for you all to think about, is because increasingly it's going to be a problem in global business, where the company has global ethical standards, but it may bump into national law, which is in opposition or in conflict with those ethical standards. And then do you stay and just follow the law? Do you try to change the law? Are you civilly disobedient? Or is it so serious that you have to leave the country? So this is a very, very serious problem.
Right. So another hot-button issue, in addition to child labor, is, of course, corruption. And I remember several years ago when I was still in Japan, attending a GE Japan holiday party. And before we were able to get to the wonderful food that was there, we had to actually watch a video on GE's fight against corruption. And I thought that was a tremendous thing. It was wonderful.
This is a holiday party?
It was a holiday party.
Wow.
But anyway, so anti-corruption is a hot-button issue. In 2015, Japan's Ministry of Economy and Industry, METI, revised its guidelines for the prevention of bribery of public foreign officials. Fighting against corruption is considered one of the best practices for Japanese companies doing business overseas. And I have heard that in addition to this holiday party video, GE has had successful measures in fighting against corruption, and especially not paying bribes, and especially small bribes, so facilitation payments. Especially in those countries where bribery is considered to be the norm. Can you tell us a little bit about what GE did?
Yeah, I think we need to distinguish right at the outset between grand bribery and petty bribery. Okay. And petty bribery are these facilitating payments to the customs clerk or to the policeman who stops you for speeding, or for the inspector who comes and looks at your basement. So let's put those aside for a minute. Let's talk about grand corruption, which is really how you get business. It's an attempt to get big orders and or policy change, where you're basically bribing the leaders of the country, or the private sector too. And long ago, I was fortunate enough to have a CEO who strongly believed that corruption was an anathema to big global business. It hurt competition, it hurt pricing, it corrupted the culture of the company. It was basically bad. So GE was one of a number of companies which formed something called Transparency International, but we then also were very active in what was known as the OECD Convention, which was basically prohibited bribery in foreign nations. Every nation has got prohibitions against bribery. A Japanese company can't bribe in Japan under the law. That's usually clear. It's true in Switzerland or Germany or Romania or France or whatever. But the question was, could you bribe outside of Japan or outside of the United States or outside of France? And so this OECD convention made it a crime to basically bribe public figures for gain outside of your host country. And it was that the Japanese ratified. They have then enacted the law. Yes. I think I'm not familiar exactly with what MEDI did, but they probably were modifying a law that already existed, because this this convention is 20 years old. So at GE, when I was there, we had a very firm, both legal and ethical position, which is we simply wouldn't bribe. You were fired if you bribed. I mean, flat out, gone. It couldn't be clear that it was not allowed. It's not to say in a company of 320,000 people we were perfect, but we were. I think on this we were pretty good, because we deeply believed, and we also believed that we could get market share from cost and quality without bribing. And the good example of that, which is the biggest bribery scandal, one of the biggest bribery scandals in the industrial side, which many of you may know about, was Siemens, which basically about 8 years ago was caught up short, partly because of this OECD convention, both in Germany and in the United States and in other jurisdictions. In their telecoms business, in their healthcare business, in their transportation business, and in their power business. All the heads of those businesses were decapitated. They were gone. The chairman of the board was gone. The CEO was gone. The general counsel was gone. The head of compliance was gone. They had to completely clean house because Siemens for years had been bribing overseas. They had 2,000 business consulting agreements, which were basically agreements to bribe. And they ended up paying about $2 billion in fines and settlements with different governments to resolve this. And they spent $1 billion on forensic costs, $1 billion on forensic costs investigating. GE competed against Siemens. We had higher margins and greater market share. And the argument was we had cost and quality. And although it is certainly true, and I'm not naive, believe me, I've been around the world a few times, but it is true that sometimes the decision makers, the minister of power or his subordinates, are civil servants, and that they really want to do what's right for their country. And so they are willing to buy on cost and quality. But there are times when you just have to say no, and you will lose orders. And yet if you compare GE and Siemens during the relevant time period, we had bigger market share and higher margins, and we didn't bribe. And so I think part of it is just saying no. You have to have a very strong policy against it.
Right.
Then there are many other things you can do to try to change the policies. But eradicating corruption And like this meaty directive is very important. It's very important that big global companies not bribe. But part of corruption, of course, the most important part, is in the indigenous countries. It's about power. It's about the abuse of power. It's about the lack of the legal system. There are things that go far beyond what companies can do.
Right.
So what companies can do is try to stay clean and try to be involved in the social and political change necessary to eradicate corruption. But that second part is hard. Being clean and not bribing, you can do, even if you're prepared to lose some orders. But changing the society, changing Indonesia, changing Nigeria, not so easy.
Right.
So that's a long discussion for another time. But I mean about how the role that corporations should play in political and social change. But it's an important subject.
Mm-hmm. So compliance or corruption is oftentimes, it is a due diligence item in today's M&A. And I'm sure you have had many, many due diligence results shown to you, a potential acquisition target, where you may actually see that the target company is not necessarily 100% clean. How did you make your decision in terms of whether to go forward with the acquisition? What the
I think a lot of it, it's a great question. I think a lot of it depends on the regulatory regime you're operating under. When I started, we could go to the Department of Justice and say, we're going to acquire company X, and they're dirty, but we'll commit to clean it up. And because we had a decent reputation with the regulators, the Department of Justice, the SEC, what have you, they'd say, okay, we trust you, GE, you go do it. Today, that doesn't work. They say basically, it has to be cleaned up before you buy it, or it's your problem. So, now again, everyone's experience can be different, but I'm giving you sort of one model of how this works. Mm-hmm. So you basically have to go to the company and say, you've got to clean this up. You've got to go to the Justice Department or the DG4 in the EU or whoever the appropriate authority is in Japan and solve this problem before we're going to buy you. And we, in the later years, at the beginning, in the late 80s and early 90s, when I had just started, we could go to the government and say, we'll take a dirty company and clean it up. In the later years, they'd say, no. If you want to buy the company, you've got to turn them in, and they've got to clean it up before you buy it, or it's your criminal problem, which you don't want to do. So you would then have to go to the board of the company and say, you're going to have to throw in the top business leaders who were doing the bribery and pay the fine before we're going to buy you. And in fact, we basically scuttled a number of deals. So that's problem one. If you discover it in diligence, I think the general rule of thumb today is that you've got to solve it before you close, unless you want it to be your criminal problem.
Right.
The second dimension of it is, if you don't discover it, when you buy the company and the deal closes, you've got to get on your horse and ride as fast as you can to really audit the company and discover what's there. Because you can still go to the regulators and say, look, we did complete diligence, but this was fraud. There are hidden books in Bangkok or someplace, and we didn't find them. But we've, now that we own the company, we have control of it and the books. We've done it, and we should get not a pass. We'll pay the fine, but we shouldn't be charged criminally, which is what the biggest problem, of course. So you've got to solve the problem before you close, or if you close, you've got to make sure that you do the diligence immediately, so that you discover the problem and deal with it. But I think increasingly, some of these international deals, where there's a lot of hair on them, where there's a lot of graft or corruption, aren't going forward. And this is not just in bribery. Just to give you two very quick examples, we bought a company in China in the early 90s, a lighting factory, makes light bulbs. But we didn't do diligence. The chairman was very anxious to get into China. He was willing to pay anything, just go. By sheer luck, I happened to be the first senior officer, it was just outside of Shanghai, who was visiting him, just because I happened to be on a sort of around-the-world trip. When I got there, I discovered that they were basically using mercury in the manufacturing process, which is the most dangerous chemical. And the mercury was going to the sluiceways, and then the sluiceways were going to the rice paddies. I mean, this is literally the high crime in the environmental area. So we basically, when I reported back, and it was something that we now owned it. It was nothing we could tolerate. We had to spend a huge amount of money on environmental remediation because we hadn't done proper diligence on the environmental issues. And by the time we were finished doing the remediation, the deal was worthless. It became completely uneconomical. It was a serious mistake. Had we done the diligence and been sensitive to the compliance issues prior to the close, we probably wouldn't have bought them. And again, in 2 seconds, a comparable situation, but where we were a little smarter, was we were going to buy a locomotive company in Russia. That was the Russian locomotive company. And we had to get through some national security issues, so I'm not sure we would ever have been able to do it. But we sent our environmental team over there, and they came back and they said, what a surprise. They've been building locomotives, since the Russian Revolution, and it's a toxic dump. I mean, it's not remediable. It is so horrible that there's not enough money in the world to fix it. And so that was a case where, again, we had warning through the diligence, and we decided not to go forward with the deal. So this question of diligence and whether you can find it out beforehand and fix it, or whether you find it out immediately afterwards. And if you don't find it out immediately afterwards, and a year later it pops up, it's your problem, and you get criminal action.
So when you're taking control, when you're acquiring the majority or 100%, it may be easier to clean up. But what if you didn't discover the compliance incident, unfortunately, during due diligence, and later on, going in as a minority shareholder, you're discovering that something is amiss at this company? How do you deal with that?
So you're saying if the distinction here that you're a minority shareholder as opposed to...
Right.
Well, we had a general rule never to be a minority shareholder.
Oh, I see. Right.
I mean,
right.
For that reason.
Because,
Because, I mean, we for years of global business, we just concluded that you were just inheriting other people's problems over which you had no control. Part of the problem, I think, and this is why some of what I say may not be entirely relevant, is that when I was there, we were a big, iconic global company. I mean, if you had to list 5 companies who were the exemplars of globalization, GE was one of them.
Sure.
And so we had to be extremely careful
of course.
And not get ourselves in reputational problems. And so that's why we, as a general matter, never wanted to do minority JVs.
That's a wise strategy. So you probably have been reading in the papers that in recent years in Japan, there have been quite a number of compliance incidents where management was involved. Now, what can the legal department or the head of legal do to prevent non-compliance at the core of the company, i.e. management?
Well, I think one of the things, everyone who listens to what I'm saying may move on to other companies. And one of the most important things you have to do is due diligence. Do your own due diligence on your CEO, because there's nothing worse, no greater hell than when you're working for a corrupt CEO, and it can be very hard to get out. You're sacrificing a lot of. So when you go into the job, one of the things you can do is due diligence. Now, people may be looking at me and saying the guy's crazy, but think about it for a second. When you're competing for the job, it may be hard to ask hard questions. But let's say you get offered the job. There is a period between offer and acceptance when you have an opportunity to gently say, I'd like to talk to the audit staff, I'd like to talk to the CFO, I'd like to talk to the head of compliance, I'd like to talk to a board member, I'd like to talk to the vice chairman. And you can do that all in the context of, I want to decide if I want to take the job that's been offered to me. And at that point, you can be, whether the questions are direct or indirect, you can begin to get a sense of it. If you have a bad CEO, obviously the governance rules and jurisdictions are different. You can certainly go to the board. It's very risky. I mean, you can only do that once, and the board's either going to side with you or they're going to side with the CEO, and if they side with the CEO, you're gone, probably. But again, at least with the enhanced governance standards of the modern corporation, there is at least a reasonable chance that you can go to the board. And one of the things I recommend as good governance is that the board should meet twice a year alone with this general counsel, just as they do with the audit staff. So you have a formal, regular, routinized opportunity to speak to the board about issues, in which you can do, again, in a delicate way, which may have them take a look at the CEO. But if you have a corrupt CEO, other than going to the board, and it goes back to what I discussed before, that one of the issues the inside lawyers have to think about that is sort of a corollary of the partner-guardian tension, which is the biggest problem you have to resolve, is, I indicated before, you've got to be prepared to resign. You've got to decide before you go, take one of these jobs, that your integrity, that who you are, that your ethics are such that at some point there will be a line over which you will not go. Now, that's not to say that, again, CEO is the CEO. He or she gets to decide. There's usually a range of discretion. Not every decision is going to be one that you agree with. Most of those would not be offenses or problems that would lead to resignation, but there will be some.
Thank you.
Primarily, fundamental violations of law.
Right. I think this due diligence on the CEO is a very novel idea, at least to me, so thank you for sharing that. So I'd like to go into the third sort of set of questions. So leading the law department, especially when the global integration of law departments. You state that where there are legal department members throughout the globe in multiple locations, it is important to integrate them so that there is a sense of accountability that these members have to each other. Can you elaborate on that?
I think again, I think it's pretty straightforward. First of all, in this era of digitization, you can knit the department together with all sorts of digital tools and training and updates, and make them live and interesting. So that's a start. You can have a backbone of computerization, digitization that used to be on paper before. So that just start there. That's important. You have to have leaders who have a vision for the corporation. Obviously, my vision for the corporation's legal department, obviously my vision was reflected in this book, although the book didn't exist when I was leading the company, but I would talk things like this. So that part of the leader's job is to go around the world. I went around the world twice a year, always, and I tried to visit every group of lawyers, whether they were in China or Japan or Indonesia or all of the Asian lawyers or India, whatever the case would be, where I would spend 3 or 4 days listening to people. I mean, what were their issues? What were the matters that were of concern to them? I would give them, to some extent, my vision of where I thought I wanted the legal organization to go, what our issues were, how we related to the goals of the CEO, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole leadership reaching all the lawyers, which is really important. And I always said at the beginning of the year, I would send an email out to everybody, and I said, look, if you've got a problem, I'm the general counsel, I have 1,400 lawyers working for me, 1,400. But I would say, if you have a problem and you can't get that solved with the lawyer who you're working for or the lawyer above them, here's my email, write me. So that I really felt that the door was open. Now, in terms of integration, we had 14 different businesses. So one way to do it is just by region. All the lawyers in France, all the lawyers in Russia, all the lawyers in Spain, all the lawyers in Japan, regardless of whether they were in aircraft engines or power or healthcare or finance, they would all come together because they would have common issues in the jurisdiction. But we'd also then split them up by business so that the power lawyers for all of Asia would meet, because they would have a different cut at the issues, because the energy sector would have maybe some similarities and differences that were important for them to discuss. So we did it both by region and by business unit. And then at the top of the company, I had a quarterly meeting, and people had to come of the top 35 lawyers in the company, so that we developed a real sense of rapport and partnership, if you will. So there are a lot of different ways in which you can integrate. And then we also had something called practice groups, which is like a law firm, so that you'd organize by country, you organize by business, but you'd then organize by legal specialty. There'd be an IP group, an antitrust group, a mergers and acquisition group, and that was just like a big law firm. And the sort of senior person in headquarters who worked directly for me, the head of global M&A for GE, would usually be the leader of that group with someone from one of the businesses. So we had both headquarters and business representation. So in a nutshell, that's how we did it. And I think for those of you who are interested, there is a whole chapter in the book about leading the global legal organization.
Yes. So that clock is 5 minutes fast, so we have 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Okay. So let me ask you my last question, which is that your book has been very inspiring. This conversation has been very inspiring. We really hope that in Japan, too, there's going to be an Inside Counsel Revolution. So in addition to all the wisdom, the words you have shared with us, is there anything that you want to say to our Japanese audience?
Yes, I think the hardest part of your job may be to explain to your business leaders the ideals that I've been talking about today. Because you can talk amongst yourselves, and that's good, and you can try to do it, but what you really need is support from the top, not resistance from the top.
Right.
You have to explain the vision to them. You have to basically figure out a way to take this book and shorten it. I've written another book, unfortunately, which is not translated into Japanese.
What's the name of the
book? Called
book?
High Performance with High Integrity.
Okay.
And it's written this is written primarily for key staff. I mean, if you're a CFO, you could read it, the head risk, head of compliance, head of HR, and operational leaders and CEOs. But the other book, High Performance with High Integrity, is very short. It was published by the Harvard Business Press in 2008. Very, very short, and the CEOs read it. People give it to the CEOs. But I think the point is not my books. The point is you need to distill from this, from your own conversations, from other writings, what it is that you think you need the CEO to understand, which is, and in Japan, at least in some companies, it may be very different than the understandings that exist today. How can you persuade and explain to the business leaders and to the boards what the ideal is, why it's important, what are the implications in terms of your independence and autonomy, and what they expect from you, that your business leaders really expect candor. I was very lucky. I worked for one of the great business leaders of the 20th century, and he was a very candid, earthy person, and we didn't know. I'd never met him. When I went to GE, I had not done 1 hour of work for GE. I did not know a single one of the 340,000 people, not a single one. He interviewed me for 30 minutes and offered me the job. And before I took the job, we did have a discussion. I said, look, what I'm going to give you is my best judgment. You have to want it. If you want someone, who's going to come in and say, you're a genius, boss, that's not me. So that's fine. I mean, I'm happily practicing law in Washington. I'll go back in the government. No big deal. But I was very lucky because he was for all his complexities, he was a truth seeker, and he was never afraid of hearing the news, good or bad. So you have to. My last thought, I think, for you is that you've got to distill your ideal view of what you do, but how that relates to the management around you, and explain to them what your ideal is and why it's good for the company. So this isn't about you, this is why it's good for the company. And hopefully the vision of high performance with high integrity and sound risk management will have some resonance, and that you have an important role in realizing that goal of global capitalism. Anyway, thanks very much for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.
Such an inspiration.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you very much. Thank you.